Des Moines, Senator Bernie Sanders has opened up a lead in Iowa just over a week before the Democratic caucuses, consolidating support from liberals and benefiting from divisions among more moderate presidential candidates who are clustered behind him, according to a New York Times, Siena College poll of likely caucus-goers.
Mr. Sanders has gained 6 points since the last time Siena survey, in late October, and is now capturing 25% of the vote in Iowa. Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. have remained stagnant since the fall, with Mr. Buttigieg capturing 18% and Mr. Biden 17%.
The rise of Mr. Sanders has come at the expense of his fellow progressive, Senator Elizabeth Warren. She dropped from 22% in the October poll, enough to lead the field, to 15% in this survey. Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is garnering 8%, is the only other candidate approaching double digits.
The changing fortunes of the leading candidates underscores the volatile nature of the primary after more than a year of campaigning, as voters wrestle with which candidate can defeat President Trump. Despite the ascent of Mr. Sanders, a self-described democratic socialist, the poll also highlighted the combined appeal of the centrists. 55% of those surveyed said they preferred a standard-bearer who is more moderate than most Democrats. Just 38% said they wanted one who is more liberal than most Democrats.
As the strength of the other leading candidates has ebbed and flowed, Mr. Sanders, making his second run for the White House, appears to be peaking at the right time. This month was the first time he has finished atop a poll in Iowa, after also leading a Des Moines Register CNN survey 2 weeks ago. The Times Siena poll's margin of error was plus or minus 4.8 percentage points.
A victory by Mr. Sanders in Iowa, where he suffered a narrow loss to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, would represent a remarkable comeback for a 78-year-old candidate whose heart attack in October threatened to upend his candidacy. It would also create a moment of high anxiety for establishment-aligned Democrats who are deeply alarmed about a potential Sanders nomination.
Should he prevail in Iowa and face a similarly fractured field of mainstream rivals in New Hampshire, where he also currently leads in the polls, Mr. Sanders could be difficult to slow.
Several voters who backed Mr. Sanders cited the consistency of his positions over the course of his career, and their ideological alignment with his views.
"Bernie's authentic," said Austin Sturch, 25, of Evansdale, adding, "Pretty much everything he's saying, I can't put it better than he can."
Still, much here remains uncertain. Iowa voters are famous for settling on a candidate late, and this year is no different. Mr. Sanders, along with the other senators in the race, is pinned down in Washington during Mr. Trump's impeachment trial and unable to campaign here on weekdays. And the final results could turn on two factors that will not be known until caucus night: the size and composition of the electorate, and the preferences of voters whose first choices are eliminated because of the arcane caucus rules.
If the other leading candidates finish bunched together on caucus night on February 3, it is unlikely any of them will drop out of the race after Iowa. Each of the three top hopefuls trailing Mr. Sanders has the money to compete in New Hampshire, which is just a week later.
And should no clear moderate alternative to Mr. Sanders emerge from the early nominating states, the self-financing Michael R. Bloomberg, who has already spent more than $260 million on advertising and hired more than 1,000 staff members, is awaiting the field on Super Tuesday in early March.
But first is Iowa, where the race remains up for grabs to an unusual degree so late in the race. In the Times poll, nearly 40% of voters said they could still be persuaded to caucus for a different candidate.
Mr. Sanders, however, has some of the most committed supporters in the race and, significantly, his advantage with Iowa Democrats does not ebb when the field is narrowed to only the top 4 candidates. The Vermont senator still leads by 7 points in that scenario, according to the survey, capturing 30% of the vote, while Mr. Biden and Mr. Buttigieg both win 23% and Ms. Warren garners 19%. These results are important because of how the caucuses work in Iowa. Candidates must receive 15% support in a precinct to reach what is called viability, meaning they are eligible to win delegates. If a candidate falls short of that number, his or her supporters can either leave the caucus or support better-performing contenders for the second and final vote of the evening. So voters' second choices can prove crucial. Ms. Warren, according to the poll, is the top second-choice preference of caucus-goers, which could lift her candidacy after the initial vote. But that is in part because she is the preferred alternative for those who support Mr. Sanders, who will most likely meet the viability threshold in nearly all of the caucuses.
Ms. Klobuchar's supporters could play the most crucial role, though, should she fail to achieve 15% in most precincts. When voters were asked whom they would support if they were left with only 4 choices, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Buttigieg, Mr. Biden and Ms. Warren, Mr. Biden was the overwhelming favorite of Ms. Klobuchar's backers. He received 55% of them in this scenario while Ms. Warren received 18%.
One troubling sign for Mr. Sanders came in an ideological matchup with Mr. Trump. In the Times, Siena poll, 56% of caucus-goers said they thought a Democratic socialist would have a harder rather than an easier time defeating the president, a higher number than those who said the same about a woman, a gay candidate or one over 75.
In fact, among general election voters in Iowa, a state he carried by nearly 10 points 4 years ago, Mr. Trump defeated all of the top 5 candidates as well as Mr. Bloomberg in head-to-head matchups. He bested Mr. Sanders, 48% to 42%.
More broadly, the survey of Iowa Democrats showcases the same generational and ideological divisions that the party is grappling with nationally, and helps illuminate why voters are so deeply divided over whom to support.
Mr. Sanders leads with Iowa voters under 30, taking 40% of that bloc, which is more than double his nearest competitor in the demographic. But he is winning only 9% among voters 65 and older. At the same time, Mr. Biden is capturing 32% of the vote among those over 65 but receiving just 10% among the youngest Iowa caucus goers.
Mr. Sanders's advantage owes largely to voters who align with his progressive agenda. 43% of caucus goers who call themselves very liberal are supporting his bid, well above the next closest candidate.
At the same time, those voters who are closer to the political center are split. Among moderate or conservative caucus goers, 25% are backing Mr. Biden, 21% are for Mr. Buttigieg and 12% are with Ms. Klobuchar. Among those who say they are somewhat conservative, Ms. Klobuchar garners 28%, Mr. Buttigieg 17% and Mr. Biden 15%. Of course, voters here do not always fall neatly along ideological lines. Sean Reynolds, a 68-year-old retired art teacher from Des Moines, said she supported Ms. Warren but Mr. Biden was her second choice. "I'm really on the fence I guess between the two of them," said Ms. Reynolds, adding that she planned to caucus for Ms. Warren and had even volunteered to help set up the Warren Corner at her precinct on caucus night despite her ambivalence.
There were several signs in the poll illustrating why Ms. Warren has fallen in Iowa since her peak last fall. Many voters in Iowa are fixated on elevating a candidate who can beat Mr. Trump, but 38% of likely caucus goers said they thought a female candidate would have a harder time beating Mr. Trump. And only 51% of those who indicated Ms. Warren was their first choice said she would be the best at beating Mr. Trump.
And while Ms. Warren's support fell across nearly all groups in the poll, her decline was particularly pronounced among young voters. Just 16% of 18 to 29-year-olds supported her in the poll, down from 38% in October.
Ms. Warren has also been trying to quell concerns about her sweeping agenda, particularly Medicare for All, and its impact on the general election. Those efforts appear to have hurt her with some voters here. The poll showed that only 18% of likely caucus goers think she would be best at improving health care, compared to 32% for Mr. Sanders.
Those findings bode well for Mr. Sanders. If Ms. Warren does not regain her footing, he can continue to solidify the backing of progressive voters who say they want fundamental change.
Another advantage for Mr. Sanders is that he has retained many of his supporters from 2016, when his near victory against Mrs. Clinton turned him into a credible threat for the Democratic nomination. 48% of likely caucus goers who said Mr. Sanders was their first choice said they had caucused for him last time, too.
Among those voters was Deborah Marlin, a 54-year-old small business owner from Clarinda, who said her top issues were Medicare for All and student debt.
He gives people a voice who have not had a voice before, she said. He sees the unseen such as people with disabilities, low-income workers, people with medical conditions. He sees the younger people in financial distress.
Asked whether she had a second-choice candidate, she said she did not. "I'm a Bernie or bust," she said.
Nate Cohn and Nick Karasaniti contributed reporting.
The New York Times, Siena College Research Institute survey of 1,689 registered voters in Iowa, including 584 Democratic caucus goers, was conducted from January 20 to January 23. The margin of error due to sampling is plus or minus 4.8 percentage points for the Democratic caucus electorate and plus or minus 2.8 percentage points for registered voters.